This game shows clearly why Magnus Carlsen is better than everybody else. And one of the interesting things about it, it's all about ideas. There's not really long, sharp, complicated calculations. It's about concepts and ideas. This was played in 2007 at the Candidates against fellow Super Grandmaster Levon Aronian. And Carlsen has white, Aronian has black. Aronian was actually the higher rated player at this point in history. So let us jump right in. Magnus Carlsen with the white pieces begins with knight to f3, knight f6, c4, sort of a ready English type approach where you avoid early direct contact. These types of openings tend to be more positional. b6, Aronian looking to control the e4 square. g3, Carlsen also flying Ketos, but on the king side. c5, black gets his share of the center, controlling d4, bishop to g2, bishop to b7. Those bishops oppose each other. Castles, and e6. Black is angling at the move d5 to increase his space. Knight to c3, bishop to e7, and rook to e1. The idea here, this somewhat mysterious rook move from f1 to e1, is to support the advance e2, e4 to gain more space in the center. So Aronian goes ahead and plays d5 here. Magnus takes. Now, if black takes with the pawn, after d4, white gets a pretty good position here. This is kind of like a Grunfeld reversed, but white is in good shape and has a big plus score here. So knight to d5. Instead, from Aronian, d4 is played here. Aronian takes on c3, bc3. Now, white Magnus would like to play e4 here. So Aronian's next move is pretty smart. He plays bishop to e4, right? He puts his bishop on that square, so white can't play e4. At the same time, if white moves this knight, he'll be able to trade off this powerful g2 bishop. So this bishop at e4 is perfectly positioned strategically. Magnus does go ahead and play knight to e5 and allow those bishops to get traded, castles, and e4. So we see white has a central space advantage, and black has a queenside pawn majority. So a central majority versus a queenside majority is the situation so far. Aronian plays queen to c8. The idea seems, I'm pretty sure, is to just play queen to b7 and place that queen on that light square diagonal, aiming at e4. He would like white to have to play f3 to defend that pawn. That would loosen up white's king defense. Instead, Magnus plays queen to g4. And there are some potential threats here, not yet so much, but the bishop could go to h6 and take advantage of the pin on this g7 pawn. Aronian plays bishop to f6. That puts some pressure on the knight. He might be threatening to take it. It would double the pawns, but would also give Magnus a nice cluster of pawns around black's king. He decides to just avoid that altogether, and Magnus retreats the knight back to f3. And here he does have a concrete threat. The idea of playing e4, e5, kicking that bishop away, and then bishop to h6. That's a real threat that black has to deal with. Obviously, if he plays g6, he would lose the exchange. So he sidesteps the pin that the queen has on the g7 pawn by playing king to h8. Magnus plays h4, continuing to gain space. And this is one of these key ideas of space gaining, and we'll see this h-pawn becomes a critical component of Magnus's play in this game. Knight to c6, Aronian piles on the d4 pawn, threatening it 3 times with the bishop, knight, and c5 pawn. It's only defended twice by the c3 pawn and the knight at f3. So Magnus plays bishop to g5, offering to not only trade off a key defensive piece for Aronian's king, but also remove one of the attacking pieces on d4. If e5 to try to trade queens, then after queen c8, rook a c8, d5, Magnus has a passed pawn in the center of the board. It's protected, and he is better there. So instead, Aronian goes ahead and takes on d4. Magnus plays bishop takes bishop as an intermezzo, not only to damage the pawn structure, but also to remove an attacker on d4. Pawn takes, and he retakes with the c-pawn. The computers show another strong idea, queen to f4, directly attacking the f6 pawn, and after king to g7, cd4, he's doing quite well. He goes ahead and he just takes on d4, no problem. But the reason queen to f4 is an interesting idea is it avoids black's next move. Aronian plays e5 here, offering the exchange of queens while attacking the d4 pawn twice with the e5 pawn and the c6 knight. So queens do come off the board. Rook a to c8, and now d5. Magnus has his passed pawn in the middle of the board, the protected passed pawn. Knight to a5 from Aronian. So we can sort of assess this position, right? Black his trumps are that he's got this queenside pawn majority, 2 versus 1, which makes it easier for him to create a passed pawn on the queen side that he can advance and try to queen later. White has this d5 pawn that can advance and move forward, but also one thing Carlsen can do, he can play h5 and maneuver the knight via h4 onto this f5 square. The knight would be very powerful there, including controlling this blockading square at d6. So we'll see how this unfolds. Magnus does play h5, excuse me, with the idea of knight h4, knight f5. Aronian plays knight to c4. Basically, he's rerouting the knight to the blockading square on d6. When you have a protected passed pawn, you need to blockade it. Knights are the best blockading pieces, so he maneuvers the knight to d6 to blockade. Magnus plays knight to h4, aiming at the f5 square, and now knight to d6. Aronian has blocked the pawn for now. Magnus's next move, though, may be the best move of the game, and it's the kind of move that maybe even one of his fellow super grandmasters might miss. And this is the kind of move that really separates Magnus Carlsen from his peers. And we'll see how unbelievably uncomfortable this move is for black going forward. But it's a move you don't really realize how powerful it is at first until later. And it's this move, h6. Now, the idea is that he's blocking in this king, so the threat of a back rank mate is quite serious. The king would have to move twice to go to f8 in order to get out of any potential future back rank threats. At the moment, there are no back rank threats, so you don't think about it, but as the game unfolds, they will emerge. Also, the weakness of this g7 square, very important, but will Magnus be able to get a piece to this square that matters? Well, we'll see as the game goes on. Rook to c3 from Aronian, preparing to double on the c-file. Magnus challenges that rook, and here Aronian plays rook f to c8. Well, what if he plays a move like this? Knight takes e4. White cannot take the knight because he would lose the rook at c1. After rook takes c3, knight takes c3. Black is attacking the pawn, and it looks like he's in pretty good shape. The problem is after d6, rook to d8, knight to f5, it is in fact white that is better. And the threat of f4 opening up this center, combined with d7, the rook could not take the pawn because of mate on e8 if this e-file were to open up. That's a perfect example of how this move h6, keeping this king stuck back here on h8, unlocks all of white's possibilities. A very powerful idea. Aronian does not take the e4 pawn. Instead, he doubles on the c-file. Rook takes c3, rook takes c3. And here, another move that some might resist. He goes ahead and plays knight to f5. That does challenge the knight at d6, but it also trades off a strong knight, gets rid of a strong square, and gets rid of the protector of the d5 pawn. So he's giving up a lot. But he knows that the situation with this black king makes this all good for him. So knight takes pawn, ef5. So he's lost the good square, and now this pawn is isolated. But what if Aronian were to play rook to d3 and follow the basic principle that rooks belong behind passed pawns in an endgame? He would lose immediately with rook to c1. And the threat of back rank mate cannot be stopped. It can be delayed for a move or two, but it cannot be stopped. So now he cannot put his rook behind the pawn. So what does Aronian do? He plays king to g8. Now he can put the rook behind the pawn because he's running away from the back rank problems. But then Carlsen has another brilliant idea. Remember we talked about how this g7 square is a weak square? Rook to e4, with ideas of going rook g4, rook to g7, which would attack h7 and f7. A very strong idea. King to f8 is played, and now rook to g4, coming in and attacking, particularly the h7 pawn. If Aronian puts his rook behind the passed pawn, again, that's the move you want to play as black, then rook to g7, rook takes d5, rook takes h7, rook, king back, then rook to g7 check, and the king would have to go to h8. If he goes to f8, then Carlsen would just pull the rook back, and the pawn could not be stopped. So after king h8, rook to f7, and Carlsen is threatening f6, he's threatening a7, and he's just winning there. So instead, Aronian plays the rook to c7, rook goes to g7, and now b5. He begins to push the pawns that he has on the queen side, but it's a little late. Hasn't had a lot of time to do that. Rook takes h7, king to g8, rook to g7 check. Again, the king has to go to h8, because if it goes to f8, just the rook pulls back and boom, boom, nothing he can do. So king to h8, d6, hits the rook, rook to d7, king to f3. Now, it looks like he's just giving up this very powerful d6 pawn, but what if Aronian takes it? Then rook takes f7, too many threats, threatening a7, the king is threatening to go king g4, h5, g6, with all kind of mating threats, and if black tries to stop that, the f6 pawn would fall. So Aronian does not take that pawn. He plays b4, continuing the plan of advancing his queenside. King to e4, he goes a different direction. Obviously, he's threatening to play king to d5, which would protect the pawn, and he'd come in, that would be it. So now Aronian has to take the pawn. Rook takes d6, but Carlsen is not in a convenient position to get over to g4 now. He takes on f7, which also attacks the a7 pawn. Rook to a6, trying to use the rook to defend these two weaknesses on f6 and a7, while also attacking white's a2 pawn. And here Carlsen comes up with a brilliant, brilliant plan, a brilliant breakthrough. He plays g4. And here's his idea. He wants to play g5, which is going to cause all kinds of trouble. That's his breakthrough concept. Aronian plays king to g8, threatening the rook, but Carlsen ignores that threat and just plays h7 check. The rook cannot be taken because he would just queen that pawn. So the king is forced back to h8. This whole game, after h6, he's just made sure this king is stuck on the h8 square this whole time. And now g5. Aronian can't allow him to just play g6 here. So he takes, but then f6. And in this position, Levon Aronian resigned. The threat of king to f5, king to g6, followed by rook to f8 mate is devastating for black. If he tries to, say, take on a2, king to f5, he could play rook to d2 with the idea of bringing the rook back to stop the threats on the back rank. The problem is after king to g6, now threatening rook to f8 mate, if he plays rook to d8, which he would have to do, then just rook to e7. And Carlsen will just play f7 and then rook to e8 check, and that would be the end of the show. And if Aronian just tries to win the race by playing b3, then still king to g6. And now rook to f8 mate is unstoppable. An amazing game. Now, this was 07. Carlsen would not become world champion for another 6 years, and Aronian would win this match, actually. But this was a glimpse at the brilliance yet to come. Now the #1 player in the world for, I believe, 14 years, Magnus. Hope you've enjoyed this game. See you again soon at Chess Dog. Goodbye.